Hello and greetings to everyone. Hello to the followers of the Fundación Alternativas and to Casa Árabe's followers as well on different shores and different time zones. It is really a pleasure and a privilege to have gathered a stellar cast of analysts for this webinar. The Gulf and the Maghreb in uncertain times, global players, reshaped regions, and transnational trends. Bienvenidas, bienvenidos, ahlan wa sahlan. If one follows current affairs in the southern Mediterranean and the Arabian Peninsula, it is clear that new power struggles are playing out in the region. These are not only military and economic, but also ideological forces are fighting for influence. Soft power is exercised in mysterious ways, and there is no such thing as a by-the-book concept or logic anymore when we see old alliances melt and transform in record time. Therefore, the certainties of the past are gone, and the power vacuums created by the EU's lack of action on one side and the US disengagement on the other, also heightened by the new priorities brought by the COVID-19 pandemic in the past year, have given way to greater involvement of other actors. We think of Russia and Turkey across the region, but also of Gulf countries in the Maghreb. A realignment has been taking place with surprisingly assertive foreign policies coming from Riyadh, Abu Dhabi, and Doha, adding more spice to Moscow and Ankara's concoctions. To pick up just two obvious cases, how has the conflict in Libya been shaped by these dynamics? And on the other hand, what kind of normalization with Israel is unfolding? What is the tip of the iceberg telling us about the negotiations we don't see? And where is the balance of power tilting towards? We know the Gulf and Maghreb states share interests and concerns. They certainly share a history as well, but we are yet to see if they will tend to cooperation or confrontation. Movements throughout the Mediterranean space are fragmented and encompass events at many levels, sub-regional, regional, and transcontinental. These uncertain times bring about the need to discuss who are these players, state, non-state, individuals too, lest we forget, and what are they seeking to achieve? But mostly, how is this already affecting us on both sides of the Mediterranean and on the other side of the Atlantic as well? And this is why Casa Árabe and Fundación Alternativas have joined forces to gather a set of experts who will help us to untangle some of these complicated matters. We will have two sessions of 75 minutes with 3 panelists on each session and a discussant who will gather conclusions. Then we will have a third and last segment of closing remarks. My colleague Ichazo Dominguez de Azabal will moderate the second session, and I already thank her for having joined forces and led this initiative from Fundación Alternativas. Let me start by introducing the first session, Gulf-Maghreb relations, interconnectivities, divergences, and opportunities, with its participants, Fatiha Dazi-Héni, Cinzia Bianco, Frederic Wehrey, and Irene Fernandez Molina, who will give us the conclusion. First, by order of appearance, is Fatiha. Fatiha Dazi-Héni is a researcher on Arabian Peninsula and Gulf and Middle East affairs at IRSEM, the Institute for Strategic Research at the École Militaire in Paris. She is a lecturer at Sciences Po Lille, where she teaches history and socio-political developments in the Arabian Peninsula, She has a PhD from the Institute for Political Studies in Paris. Her main line of research revolves around the monarchies of the Arabian Peninsula, as well as regional and security issues between GCC states and the Persian Gulf states. So welcome to the three of you, and Fatiha will give us a historical overview of this gradual Gulf penetration in the Maghreb, or something on those terms. Please, Fatiha.
Thank you, Karim. Hello, everybody, and thank you for having me for this panel. So I will refer in my first point to the two main recent phases of influence between the Arab Gulf monarchies and North African states. And second, I shall focus my talk on relation with Algeria and Morocco, with mentioning few words on Tunisia and Libya, and leaving aside Mauritania. So a short overview of Gulf-Maghreb relations. Generally speaking, we attend the two main phases of politics of influence from rich Arab Gulf states in North African states in the recent years. The first was during mid-90s to 2000s, even though Saudi religious soft power expanded since the 80s, but mid-90s and 2000 coincided with the economic liberalization encouraged by the IMF and the World Bank in the Arab world, and Gulf investments from Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Kuwait, and UAE began to flow in real estate, infrastructure, and services like tourism, communication, and finance in Morocco, Tunisia, and Egypt mainly, excluding Algeria due to the Black Decade of the 90s. This was according to a self-interest strategy without any malicious rivalry among GCC states at that moment. The second phase occurred during the Arab Spring decade of 2010, according to a mixed dynamic made of ideological stances and intrusive sentiments, according to polarized and divergent politics of influence from Qatar and UAE mainly, associated with the Saudi ally that displayed mainly in Libya and in Tunisia, but differently. During this phase, these Gulf states tried to use their interstate rift when the crisis has blown on June 2017 between the Arab Quartet, composed of KSA, UAE, Bahrain, and Egypt, versus Qatar. And for Gulf leaders, it was a maneuver to test their Maghrebi counterparts' loyalty. But this has not gone as in the Horn of Africa states, where the crisis affected very seriously Eastern Africa. On the reverse, the three core Maghrebi states stood a common position in adopting a non-concerted positive neutrality, all refusing to choose among their Gulf states counterparts. Now, my second point will focus on Algeria and Morocco relations with the Arab Gulf region. So referring to Algeria, this country and Arab Gulf monarchies never fully trusted themselves due to different geopolitical sensitiveness. In addition, Saudi Arabia's obvious financial support to the Algerian Salafi movement, Front Islamique du Salut, during the Black Decade, and the Gulf and the full support of GCC monarchies to Morocco on the Western Sahara issue were deterrent to good relations. But as I developed in Yahya Zubair's edited book last year, dedicated to Algeria's domestic and foreign policies, relation with Saudi Arabia never reached the breakpoint, contrary to that with Iran, that openly gave its political support to the FIS, even pushing for the establishment of an Islamic republic in Algeria. So Algiers decided to sever its diplomatic relations with Tehran during more than 8 years, which was never the case with Riyadh. Then came the Bouteflika's effect in Algeria after he spent 15 years in Traversée du Désert as a close consultant to Sheikh Zayed, where he was able to capitalize substantial networks of ties with Gulf monarchs and business tycoons. This came to be very useful for Algeria to maintain a balanced relationship during the Arab Spring decade, where Algiers shared many similar views with Iran on MENA issues, such as their rejection in listing Hezbollah as a terrorist organization that Algiers considers as the resistance axis against Israel, contrary to Gulf states. But it's mainly on Libya's Gulfian interventionist policies, as well as in Tunisia's domestic meddling from Qatar with the Nahda party and the personal proximity with Rashid Ghannouchi, and then from UAE, that has not hesitated to suspend a tripartite security cooperation comprising France, Tunisia, and UAE in training security and anti-terrorist forces in Tunisia, putting into the balance the necessity for Al-Nahda party to withdraw from the Troika Tunisian transitionary government. And this was, of course, not acceptable for the Tunisian sovereignty. And this contributed also to infuriate the Algerian government against UAE meddling in Tunisian affairs. So Bouteflika's aftermath, even though General Gaid Saleh shared good personal relationship with Mohammed bin Zayed, the strongman in UAE, and personal financial interests in Dubai, but without sharing the obsessional ideological anti-Islamist vision of MBZ. Today, institutional relations between Algeria and Gulf states respect courtesy, but are politically very poor in the sense that either President Tebboune or General Said Shangriha, Algerian Army's chief of staff, do not see any problem in integrating Islamist parties to their governance, since they were already co-opted under Bouteflika's two last mandates. As for Morocco, we all know it's by far the Maghrebi state that enjoys the closest relation with Arab Gulf monarchies. This relation reached its apex during King Hassan al-Thani and King Fahd moment during the 80s. The two kings share brotherly relation that shifted into a family one through several weddings between these two royal families. As soon as Arab Spring provoked panic among Gulf royals, and especially in Saudi Arabia and UAE, King Abdullah of Saudi Arabia proposed on May 2011 to Morocco and Jordan to join the GCC pact as a symbolic response to consolidate the Arab monarchical solidarity, to demonstrate Arab monarchical resiliency versus the failed Arab republics that have seen 4 statesmen defeated and replaced. However, Kuwait, Oman, and Bahrain, for different national, political, and economic interests, firmly opposed that Saudi and Emirati initiative, accepting just their invitation in some fields of GCC cooperation, but refusing to integrate them as full members in their integrated market. Under Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, proximity relations with Morocco changed radically, with the new generation of Al Saud princes not familiar and not used to travel to Morocco or connecting with the Moroccan elite. Added to that, the new governmental ticket, M6, and the Islamist Ben Kiran government and the Gulf crisis cooled relation between Rabat, Riyadh, and also with UAE. But the UAE, and in particular Abu Dhabi, with his strongman MBZ, since he took control of the federal state destiny early 2014, was keen to establish a strong personal relationship with King Mohammed VI. This relationship is more or less replacing the special relationships King Fahd and King Hassan al-Thani shared. MBZ and M6 share the same business vision and ambitions for their countries and same aptitude to public diplomacy vis-à-vis the West. This relation is institutionally threatened by a strong security partnership. Significant numbers of Moroccans are members of the UAE police forces. Moreover, more than 500,000 Moroccan expatriates live in UAE, Qatar, and in a lesser extent, Saudi Arabia. Although their relation also knew turbulence with the refusal of Morocco to break with Qatar, thus Rabat decided on a false pretext to sever its relation with Iran, with which it had limited interest, and accusing the Iranian embassy in Algiers of supporting and training the Polisario in order not to anger too much its Gulf allies embarked in a cold war with Iran. Both Saudi Arabia and UAE were annoyed by King Hamz's cooperation with an Islamist party. So they supported the North American candidacy against Moroccan's candidacy to host the Football World Cup in 2026. This infuriated M6, who responded through Al Jazeera channel in announcing late January 2019 his withdrawal from the Arab-led coalition in Yemen, thus provoking Casa and UAE reaction in broadcasting a report denouncing the Moroccan propagandist narrative on Western Sahara. In parallel, Qatar is the other third main Gulf monarchy to invest in the Moroccan economy and share a common vision of geopolitics, especially on the issue of political Islam. The two monarchies share cordial relations that date back to 2013, coinciding with Sheikh Tamim's access to the throne, and the new Islamist Moroccan government led by Prime Minister Ben Khelaifi from the Islamist Justice and Development Party. Emir Tamim supported Moroccan candidacy to World Cup 2026, contrary to Casa and UAE. This proximity explains the Moroccan positive neutrality during the Gulf crisis, knowing that the three Gulf states are among the top investors in Morocco. So I shall conclude mentioning two main points for the Q&A. First, Arab Spring movement hugely participated in exacerbating geopolitical divergence more than ever between the two regions, Maghreb and the Arab Gulf states, dominated by the UAE-Saudi hardline axis, because they have radical different understanding on political Islam that is already integrated in Maghrebi states and not in Saudi Arabia and UAE, that have the same hostile position of political Islam than the Algerian militaries during the Black Decade. Added to that, today geopolitical interests that ties Morocco with its Gulf allies is reinvigorated by the newly Abraham Accords that did not by itself annoyed as much Algeria, because the cooperation between Morocco and Israel dates back King Hassan al-Thani, but in contributing to aggravate and revive the Western Sahara issue, which has been in the balance for Morocco's normalization with Israel. This could revive a conflict between Rabat and Algiers, and this situation could also create a potential for a new Daesh in Western Sahara and in aggravating the sub-Saharan terrorist problematic. This situation could be very damaging for EU and especially France at the front stage, because France shares the deepest relation with Morocco and faces, since the Arab Spring decade, a fierce competition of its interest in Algeria, in Tunisia, and Libya, with Turkey that gained tremendous political, industrial, and economic influence in that countries, but also with China and Russia, with very significant position. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Fatiha, for this first introduction into what is actually a very complicated and I'd say multi-layered relations between these two blocks or these two regions. You have definitely pointed at those mysterious ways of soft power that I was mentioning, that can be date back to, as you were saying, the 1970s with Saudi and their very blunt religious, let's say, influence or interventions, but very recently also to that episode of with Al Jazeera, and how that broadcast, the type of broadcast, can also be exerting soft powers and deliver messages. I guess it's very, very tough to, in 10 minutes, manage to get the most out of these maps that are evolving, also highlighting the importance of individuals such as the MB, both MBs, the Mohammed bin Salman, MBS, Mohammed bin Zayed, MBZ. These are obviously could take in themselves just that relationship and those dynamics a whole session. But let us move forwards, and we will have time to ask questions after the first three speakers deliver their first speech. So we move to Cinzia Bianco is a visiting fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations. She's based in Berlin, where she's working on political security and economic developments in the Arabian Peninsula and the Gulf region and relations with Europe. Additionally, she's a senior analyst at Gulf State Analytics, and previously Cinzia was a research fellow for the European Commission's project on EU-GCC relations, Sharaka, between 2013 and 2014. She holds a master's degree in the Middle East and Mediterranean Studies from King's College London and a PhD in Middle East politics from the University of Exeter. So we often separate geopolitical and geoeconomic elements when we analyze the region's dynamics, whereas Cinzia, your scope finds interconnections. Please enlighten us. You have 10 minutes.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the kind invitation, and Fatiha for the great introduction. You gave us the historical context, sketched the major political dynamics and the ideological battles that are taking place in the Maghreb emanating from the Gulf. And I know that Fred has a fantastic expertise on security matters. Therefore, I thought there was a good intersection for me to cover, which is the geopolitics of infrastructures. And they are as much about security and politics in a way, as much about economic interests, of course, because, and now we will see during the short presentation, those infrastructures often overlap with political relations and are guided by security concerns. So let's go back to the starting point. While we believe that events such as a pandemic can turn back the clock on globalization, the fact of the matter is that actually globalization is accelerating, and quite prominently so, pushed at very high level from political considerations, from economic considerations, and so on and so forth, and emanating from geopolitical dynamics. So for instance, the rise of China and the fact that trade flows and flows of all kinds between China and Europe are constantly growing has given a new centrality to the Mediterranean. And this new centrality, especially in projection of the Mediterranean, has then naturally led the wealthy Gulf countries to explore opportunities to really turn the Arabian Peninsula into a pit stop, a crossroads between Asia and Europe via the Horn of Africa / Red Sea and North Africa / the Mediterranean. So we're seeing a number of projects emerging at the same time. The three main corridors that are emerging in terms of connectivity between the Maghreb and Europe are the so-called Western Corridor that goes from Morocco to Spain and then towards Northern Europe and even the United Kingdom. The Eastern Corridor, that it's just in its infancy, so really it's just about still making plans for it, that goes from Egypt to the Eastern Mediterranean, and then a so-called Central Corridor that links either Tunisia or Algeria to either Italy or Spain. or France, sorry. Why do I say either or? Because the central corridor is in fact the one most challenged by, for instance, security matters such as the war in Libya, because it was supposed to originally use Libya as a focal point, and by political developments such as the stagnation and the challenges that Tunisia is going through in the past 10 years. So let's delve a little bit deeper into these three options and see how the Gulf countries are in a way or another connected to these projects and interested or heavily involved. So let's start from the east. As we know, Egypt, after the coup d'etat that replaced the Muslim Brotherhood government with Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, has become incredibly close to the UAE and Saudi Arabia. And so it's not a coincidence that at that point, those three powers increasingly started to also share, in a way, threat perceptions and, widely speaking, geopolitical alignments. One of the elements that is shared by these actors is a general hostility vis-a-vis Turkey. And coincidentally, also countries in the Eastern Mediterranean share the same hostility and growing concerns. I'm talking, of course, mostly about Greece and Cyprus, but there are also other countries in the Arab side of the Eastern Mediterranean have found a common cause with Egypt, the UAE, and Saudi Arabia in terms of concerns over Turkey. And so together, they have been increasingly coordinating on all different matters. We have seen joint military drills. We have seen political forums, such as the one organized by Greece under the name of Philia. But we have also seen increasingly the willingness to coordinate on joint infrastructural projects. There is, of course, first and foremost, the project about gas resources and the East Med pipeline that has been under discussion for a long time and currently is actually on hold due to concerns of high costs of the initial investment needed and the possibility of an uneconomical sort of result out of the investment. So, but alongside the energy investment, there are a number of other projects that basically are about interconnectivity and facilitating trade flows and the split of industrial supply chains across different countries in a way that pulls together resources and is hopefully mutually beneficial, but also then creates those avenues for to basically channel investments and trade flows from international powers such as Asian countries. On top of that, there are projects to invest in a new kind of infrastructure, which is the digital infrastructures, such as submarine cables that transmit data and are increasingly in demand as the circulation of data increases constantly. However, this is very much a development that is in progress and relies heavily on that sort of political coordination that we started talking about. This is quite different from the opposite side of the Maghreb, which is the Western corridor that links Morocco to Spain and towards south with Senegal. So in that case, we have already a few interesting infrastructures in place. And let's start from the maritime infrastructures, for instance. The port of Dakar in Senegal is now directly connected to infrastructures on the coast of Morocco, for instance, and then north towards Spain. In all of these Southern African infrastructures, we have a heavy participation of the UAE in the financing and development of ports and maritime infrastructures. Both in Dakar and in the new development in Tangiers Med, there is a substantial contribution by the UAE in terms of investment, and there is an operating contract for DP World, the port operator from Dubai. in that equilibrium, there is also the interest and involvement of European countries, such as, for instance, France, but also Spain. And the fact that these infrastructures are increasingly connected means that also supply chains are becoming integrated slowly. On that front, there is, for instance, a French investment into a high-speed rail infrastructures that connects the Tangiers Med port in Morocco to other major economic power centers in the country, for instance, Casablanca. And finally, to the Central Corridor. In the Central Corridor, we see very clearly the competition that Fatiha already outlined. DP World, the Emirati port operator, is already present in Algiers and Janjan. But alongside those two developments, there is a growing role by together Turkey and Qatar to develop El Hamdaniya. That's directly rivaling the capacity of these two countries, of these two other infrastructures, because it has been developed as an international project that aims to turn the port in a deep sea port that has a far greater capacity that Algiers and Janjan can have. And so the fact that there are political controversies with the Algerian government certainly plays a role in the fact that there is a greater presence by the Turkish-Qatari sort of combined duo in the country and in the future of the country as it is planned than its opponents. As Fatiha said, there are common concerns, for instance, between Qatar and Turkey and Algeria on Libya, where they all oppose in a way or another, strongly or less strongly, General Khalifa Haftar. There is an alignment, for instance, and a dialogue going on between Algiers and Doha, although at times a bit confrontational on gas, for instance, and the market and the evolution of the market and what that means in terms of future developments. Then, you know, directly in competition to Algeria, there is, of course, the so-called Tunisian option. And even there has been a lot of different options put on the table by the two sides. The Emiratis have tried to engage the Tunisian government, the Saudis have tried to engage them, and the Qataris have tried to engage them with the greater success. But so far, there seems to be sort of an overarching question that is blocking the further development of the Tunisian option, which is the lack of a proper opportunity to develop a deep sea port. There's only one project, which is in Enfida, which is still in its infancy and needs further development. But therefore, the Central Corridor is sort of where all of the different sides have, in one way or another, conflicting plans and are working to develop an alternative route. Where they do agree, however, is on the necessity to further invest into new submarine cables. We have mentioned how there is a similar project going on in the Eastern Mediterranean. What I didn't say earlier is that Egypt and the Suez Canal in particular are the single biggest point of failure globally for the digital infrastructures and in particular submarine cables, because basically over 70% of cables pass through the Suez Canal and therefore through the Red Sea. And this is a major point of vulnerability on one side, but it's also a major point of leverage for the Egyptian government. It's interesting to me, I think, especially if we try to look into a little bit towards projecting towards the future, that even the Egyptian allies, such as the UAE and Saudi Arabia, all agree on the necessity to diversify from this overdependence on the Suez Canal for submarine cables, and are eager to invest into new digital connectivity and connections between the Maghreb and Europe, then potentially going further south towards Africa. And I will close here just to say that if we look at this issue of the geopolitics of infrastructure, particularly from a Gulf point of view, it's important, I think, to say that the Maghreb-Europe connection is only part of the story. In particular, if we look at an actor that has a more complex strategy, such as the UAE, the full story is to extend that connectivity towards the south, towards sub-Saharan Africa and towards the Horn of Africa. So this is suddenly important because it really puts in perspective the ambitions of these countries and sort of the very long-term perspective that we see from some of them. So for the UAE, developing maritime infrastructures in the Maghreb is as important as investing in the new rail connection between Egypt and Sudan, or new infrastructure connections between Senegal and Morocco. And then in the other maritime infrastructures in the Horn of Africa, where they have a direct influence already existing over most of the trade flowing. And I'll leave it there for questions, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Cinzia, for helping us to widen even more this jigsaw. And you are totally right in telling us that it's not only about the Maghreb and the EU and the Gulf, but of what lies to the north and to the south, i.e. the Sahel or the EU and all those corridors, and who masters in the end these infrastructures. There is a lot of power behind that. Very interesting that you do point to this over dependence of the Suez Canal. I think not only for submarine cables, but we have seen with that huge boat stranded in the Suez Canal, what over dependence of the Suez Canal can do not only to the region but to the world. So we're going to move to Frederic Wehrey. He's a senior fellow in the Middle East program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. He joins us from Washington. His research deals with armed conflict, security sectors, and identity politics, with a focus on Libya, North Africa, and the Gulf. Before joining Carnegie, Fred served as a 21-year-old veteran of the active and reserve components of the US Air Force, with tours across the Middle East and North Africa. He holds a doctorate in international relations from Oxford University and a master's in Near Eastern Studies from Princeton University. Thank you very much, Fred, for joining us. We know your focus on Libya sheds light on broader trends in the Maghreb Mediterranean basin and in the global order, especially the role of the United States and how its actions or inactions may impact or have impacted already Gulf actions in Libya. Very interesting also to be able to gauge this change we're witnessing now between the former Trump administration and the current Biden evolution. So the floor is yours for the next 10 minutes. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much for the kind introduction, and thank you for hosting this. Thanks to my co-panelists for really outstanding presentations. A tough act to follow, but I will be focusing on Libya as sort of a lens for viewing broader Gulf involvement in the Maghreb, and also I'll try to break up Gulf involvement in Libya into sort of phases to understand how we got to where we are and where we're going. Just by way of backdrop, I think Gulf involvement in the Maghreb, is really a function of some broader, global shifts toward multipolarity, and I think when we're looking at Libya, especially toward the sort of evisceration of multilateral norms on embargo enforcement, divisions within the UN Security Council, U.S. disengagement, and I really want to emphasize, and this is partly from my perspective coming from Washington, that the U.S. signaling matters in terms of managing Gulf rivalries in Libya, and we've seen this retrenchment from the U.S. in Libya over the years, disunity in the EU. All of this, I think, has conspired to really open the playing field for regional powers. We can call them middle powers, but obviously, these sparring regional powers. My co-panelists, I think, really emphasized the multiple dimensions of Maghreb involvement to include infrastructure, the economy. I want to emphasize the ideational, division, the idea that ideas matter, that this is about political order, especially when we're looking at the role of the Emirates. So again, the Maghreb and Libya, it's a place of enormous opportunity, as we heard from Dr. Bianco, this gateway to investments in Africa, an economic prize, resource rich, but it's also a place of deep insecurity, right? It's up for grabs, it's unknown. And I think that's a huge magnet for why we're seeing certain types of behavior. And so I will focus on that ideational dimension and also the Islamist dimension. When we're talking about Libya, again, Gulf involvement obviously predates the 2011 revolution. You had Gulf energy interests in Libya. You had important personalities development. And I really want to underscore the importance of individuals in the Libyan context. Libya has no institutional framework, right? No institutions. And that means brokers, intermediaries, individuals, personalities are so important for Gulf influence, channeling Gulf influence. And sometimes these are Libyan personalities that reside in the Gulf. And I think this is an important concept, that they act as intermediaries, right? And they're unreliable. I think we've seen a lot of frustration from outside powers involved in the Libyan context with the reliability of their so-called proxies, right? Proxies can defect, they can get killed. And so we've seen that, even in someone like General Haftar, there's a lot of frustration by his so-called, regional patrons. And I think that's a key story in Libya. The origins of Gulf involvement, I think, are well known. We have to go back to the 2011, intervention, the Civil War, and look at also the U.S. role. The U.S. had so much importance placed on the investment of Gulf air forces from the Qataris and from the Emiratis, and the NATO-led intervention was where these air forces, finally came out and played an important role alongside NATO forces. But on the ground, as we know, they were competing. They were competing with arms, advisors on the ground. They were establishing important links with Libyan armed groups, with Libyan personalities that endure to this day. And it explains a lot of the sort of elite competition that we're seeing today. The same networks, when we look at Dabeiba and his links to Qatar, those were forged during the 2011 revolution. The same thing with the Emirates and their links to certain factions like the Malayta brothers going through the western town of Zintan. After the fall of Gaddafi, you had a sort of lull, in the competition. You had a shift, I think, to behind the scenes influence. You had the 2012 elections. The Gulf states, they did try to shape that political context. Qatar, for instance, supported an Islamist party. But the important thing here is that, those ties of patronage, those ties of arms, of political support were always present, but they were under the table. And then, of course, they rose to the fore. They exploded into open proxy conflict starting in 2014. This is, I think, what we can term a sort of classic, proxy war, where you had local factions on the ground receiving arms from the warring regional parties. You also had these countries conducting airstrikes of their own, sending in special operations forces. The war also reverberated in the Gulf, right? You had Libyans residing in the Emirates that were arrested. And so again, this notion of spillover. The US role, I think, was incredibly important here. You did have some signaling going on at Camp David, from President Obama, telling the Gulf states, look, stop your regional rivalry. But I really want to emphasize this point. It was a very mild signaling. Why? Because the US needed the Gulf states on other regional portfolios like the Iran deal. And I really want to emphasize this. When I talk to US officials about, why aren't you taking a harder line, for instance, on the Emirates in Libya, there's this sense of a triage of priorities. Well, we need the Emirates on this particular regional file, Israel-Palestine. We need them on the Iran deal. And so Libya has sort of become a casualty, right? It's just not that important for the US to expend political capital. And I think that's why we can explain that it's opened up to this sort of rivalry. Now, of course, 2019, when Haftar launches his attack on Tripoli, we know that there was strong signaling again from the Trump administration, underscoring the importance of the US role. I think this phase really exemplifies an important turn in Gulf intervention or regional intervention in Libya. And this is the notion of direct involvement, that the Libyans are suddenly cut out of the equation. You've got foreign forces, regional forces, committing their own ground forces, their own drones, their own aircraft. And so when you talk to Libyans, you get the sense like this war is out of our hands, right? The regional states are now calling the shots. And so you've had a tremendous turn in the nature of intervention where, as we know, there are foreign mercenaries on the ground backed or financed by Gulf states, namely the Emirates, allegedly funding the Wagner group. You've also had a quantum leap, I think, in the media war, right? These states are waging a very sophisticated social media campaign to include troll factories, media franchising, cutouts, very sophisticated. And I do want to underscore this, that this combination of, on the one hand, global disorder, global norms, plus technological innovations like drones, like the social media dimension, that has facilitated a very cheap type of intervention. There's no penalties for it, right? The embargo has been violated with impunity, no penalties. Now we're in the new era, 2021, post-pandemic. We've got a new administration in the U.S. That matters. But again, we've got to think about the issue of bandwidth, right? How much bandwidth does the Biden administration really have to address Libya, to address North Africa, and also the question of prioritization, right? The Emirates are incredibly important on other files, as we've seen in the Abraham Accords, other issues. And so how much capital is the U.S. willing to expend? In my remaining time, I just want to highlight some more ways of, avenues of influence that we've seen, from the Gulf states. And again, I think the important thing is it spans the spectrum of influence. We've got soft power. We've got, I think, an important religious dimension. And I can talk about this at length in terms of the religious dimension, in terms of Salafism, right? Under Gaddafi, the regime made an investment in promoting a very quietist form of Saudi Salafism known as Markhalism. That is now expanding its influence in Libya, a direct result partly of the Gaddafi era, but also increasing Saudi origin media and religious influence. So we've got the religious dimension, the soft power dimension, but we've also got hard power. Again, kinetic airstrikes, special operations raids, mercenaries on the ground. Where are we now with Libya? Again, we've got this government of national unity. We can argue in some sense that the rivalry or the sort of malign, intense influence, especially from the Emirates, have subsided. We just had Dbeibeh meet with MBZ. So there's these positive signs of sort of pragmatism, but I don't think we're out of the woods yet. I think we've still got a fundamental, fear in terms of this ideational insecurity coming, especially from the Emirates, a fear again of Turkey, but also a willingness to recognize that events have transpired on the ground where the Turks are in the driver's seat, right? They've played their cards very well, and so you're having a recalibration, from the Emirates. Moving forward, I'll just close with this. We've got elections coming up. We could be returning to a sort of managed rivalry along the lines of what we saw in 2012, where we do have things happening behind the scenes. The conflict has shifted from open military conflict to diplomatic maneuvering to shape the appointments of important Libyan institutions, especially institutions that control the financial levers, right? The Emirates has always been concerned about the character of control of Libya's central bank, that those, oil funds could be used to divert funds to Islamist parties. So again, control of the financial levers, shaping the elections, is a restarting of military conflict, out of the question? No, I think it could happen. Again, we still have mercenaries on the ground, to include those that are funded by, by the Emirates. Just to close, again, I think the U.S. can play a key role here. We're seeing important behind the scenes signaling right now to the Emirates to try to divest themselves from the Wagner group. But again, I can say, I think I'll just conclude that we could still see, managed competition, managed behind the scenes influencing of Libya's, evolving political situation.
Thank you very much, Fred. It is indeed a very, let's say, key example, Libya, in trying to, in a way, it's sort of like an X-ray, a very open and clear signs of this competing forces, and also, as you said, very interesting how the involvement, or the direct involvement of these regional powers has become so cheap, with, as you said, technology, but also a lack of sanctions or of penalties for meddling into or participating into proxy wars, such as, on the other hand, such as Yemen. We have a few minutes before heading to Irene Fernandez Molina, who will give us some conclusions. We are waiting for some to see some reactions also from our audience, but I will ask in the same order as we started, a short question. If you could keep also your answers short, so we can have more time in case we have more questions. So my first question for Fatiha would be, you did mention towards the end that there is a real potential for an increase in violent extremism in the region due to the participation of these regional powers, and also how they managed to play some of these neighboring Maghreb countries, such as Algeria and Morocco, against each other. So if you could slightly develop on that point.
Okay. Yes, well, in fact, I very rapidly mentioned this potential factors of confrontation, but of course, it's not in the interest of Morocco and Algeria to have this kind of confrontation. But I see a revival of a potential revival of violence through the issue of Western Sahara, because of the lack of opportunity for the Polisario, the lack of the possibility to have a political issue to this file, and unfortunately, the violence could be one of the exit, and this is one of the risk. And I think that EU, and especially France, that is of course very closely attached to its Moroccan partner, have also a say in this evolution. So for sure, for France, Algeria, and Morocco, we don't see any, of course, issue to violence, but the risk is extremely high, and we have to see the reality that France, except in Morocco, have lost most of its leverage in the other Maghrebi states, and especially it's especially true in Tunisia and also in Algeria. The Turkish presence is extremely important, be it economical, politically, or the industrial leverage, and this is one of the risk I have just mentioned in the end of my contribution.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Fatiha. We're starting to receive some questions, but I will first ask Cinzia. Both the last answer from Fatiha and Fred's conclusion pointed at Turkey as an actor that is on the driver's seat. We've had very recently sort of like a fallout between the Italian Prime Minister and the Turkish President. And there is consensus over the fact that you cannot snub Turkey these days. They have played their cards quite well. I don't know, in terms of your analysis of the geopolitics of infrastructures, how do you gauge Turkey's role in the region?
So let me sort of address this question very, very briefly, but in two parts. When we speak of infrastructures, we definitely have a Turkish role that is very clear. And as Fatiha said, it's particularly clear in a place like Algeria. And it's also significant in a place like Turkey. As Fred said before, of course, Turkey is very important in Western Libya and in a port like Misrata, having talks about energy infrastructures and so on and so forth. But it does remain a player with less financial and technical capability than another player like the UAE would be. This is counterintuitive because, of course, the UAE is a much smaller state. But as a matter of fact, if we talk specifically about capacity to develop infrastructures, Turkey is a little less in a slightly less strong position. It is still a substantial actor. Then if we move towards, what to do, how to then deal with Turkey, of course, I mean, I would agree that you cannot snub Turkey as you cannot do with any very visible and relevant regional player. But what happened with the Italian Prime Minister is slightly different. There's also a personal element, in that the new Prime Minister of Italy is a person with a very long career at the highest level of governance internationally, which means that he really does not feel that he needs to mince his words too much, also because he's the head of a technocratic government. And so he feels it much easier, and because it has been part of his professional life till that point, to call an apple and really be quite blunt with his opinions. However, the full sentence of the Prime Minister was, we should call Erdogan a dictator because he thinks he is one, but that doesn't change the fact that we need to cooperate with dictators. And so it's an extremely pragmatic position that comes from a person that doesn't feel he needs to be overly diplomatic or political.
Mm-hmm.
I hope that answers the two parts question.
Thank you. Yeah, some criticisms did mention the fact that he might have autocratic trends, but he was, after all, an elected leader. Fred, I will ask you a question from our audience. Nureddin wants to know, to what extent a global power competition between the US and China will be shaping the future American engagement in the region? Is the US geopolitical shift to Asia Pacific making room for Russia and Turkey to exploit that vacuum for their benefits?
Yeah, I mean, that's a huge question, and you know, obviously, I think it's instructive to look at the posture statement, as it's called, of the U.S. Africa Command, which is responsible for the Maghreb. I mean, they are now defining great power competition as the framework through which they engage with the local, you know, partners in the Africa and also the Maghreb. And so that's instructive about how the U.S., or at least one component of the U.S. government, views, you know, the great power encroachment in the Maghreb. You know, I think the debate is still out. The U.S. is concerned, but I think there are voices in the U.S. government that recognize the U.S. still has, you know, a lot more leverage in this region in terms of security partnerships. You know, there's often the sense that, well, these countries are going to now turn to China or Russia for their arms. That could happen. There's going to be some diversifying. You know, I've seen certain proposals, you know, from the U.S. government that say, look, we need to counter, you know, China's growing influence in this region. And I think there's also voices pushing back saying, no, we're not going to adopt a Cold War, you know, framework for this. These countries are welcome to have a sort of mercantilist, you know, entree into this region. So the question the U.S. has to grapple with is, where are we going to push back? Where are we going to try to constructively engage these great powers? I don't have the answer right now, but I can say that there are these important discussions, you know, underway. That the Chinese, just to take an example, in Libya, for instance, they've pursued a very careful hedging strategy, right? They have not tied themselves to one faction or the other. They've got enormous telecom infrastructure interests. They are now intending to open an embassy, but again, they're still, you know, in the backdrop. They've not been actively involved in this proxy war. Of course, they've sold weapons like the drones to the Emirates, but they're not involved. I will say, you know, there is a huge concern about Russia in Libya from AFRICOM, from the U.S. military, that, you know, Russia has a militarized presence just on NATO's, you know, flank. The question about how to remove those Russian forces, I think, is being treated as part of a larger, you know, diplomatic settlement, a larger, you know, package of diplomatic resolution, you know, moving forward. And I think that's the great tragedy of this war, is that you had a close U.S. ally, the Emirates, a close U.S. security ally, that basically opened the door for a Russian militarized presence south of NATO's flank.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. We have a couple of questions more from the audience. However, some of them might actually be better addressed for the second panel. One is the evaluation of the Tunisian democratic transitional process and how it might be successful or not. We have Youssef Sherif on the second panel that might want to develop that. I'm just voicing them in case you want to react before we head to Irene. Another question is about the Gulf states. If any other Gulf state will start getting closer to Israel. That question from Adrián Hidalgo. One question from Beatriz Polo is about the Saudi Arabia position on the readmission of Syria in the Arab League. Some of those questions, I don't know if you want to comment on those. There's one last question from Jose Manuel Fernandez. What is the balance sheet of the politics developed by the UN and the EU in order to promote intra-Maghreb trade and integration and to reduce tensions inside and between the different states? Well, that is quite probably a deep and long answer, but Cinzia, you want to react to at least one of those questions?
Yes, I want to have first mover advantage and tackle the easiest question. I think the one on Syria, because I think it's particularly interesting to see how the Saudis have basically acknowledged that Bashar al-Assad has won the war, and they have done so already for a couple of years. But they are still sort of unsure on what's the best strategy moving forward. I think a large part of the rationale as to why Saudi Arabia reached out to Russia, for instance, was that they wanted Russia to sort of be the sole winner in a way from the external players of the Syrian war, and in a way reduce the role of Iran in the country to the favor of Russia. So basically they were supportive of a greater Russian role in Syria, especially if it served to marginalize Iran from the country. That hasn't really worked out for the Saudis so far, despite some interest on the Russian side. And moving forward, I think there are a number of options on the table. And one of those options is to readmit Syria to the Arab League. That would sort of mean that the Saudis have espoused a little bit more the logic by the UAE, who have been saying for a while now that the way to reduce the Iranian influence in Syria is by providing Bashar al-Assad with hedging options, basically, and sort of provide him with an alternative partners in the Gulf monarchies that he could sort of use to counterbalance the Iranian influence. So the whole idea of bringing the Arab Shia back to the Arab fold rather than to the Iranian framework.
Thank you. Okay, so I will pass on the word to Irene. Irene Fernandez Molina is Senior Lecturer in International Relations at the University of Exeter, which she joined in 2015. Her research deals with the international relations of the Global South, subalternity and Southern agency, foreign policies of dependent and authoritarian states, and with a regional focus on North Africa, as well as EU foreign policy and Euro-Mediterranean relations. She was previously also a research fellow at the European Neighborhood Policy Chair of the College of Europe, a Schuman Fellow at the Directorate General for External Policies of the European Parliament in Brussels, and she also was a PhD research fellow at the Complutense University here in Madrid. So Irene, you have a few minutes to sort of like wrap this up.
Thank you so much, Karim. Thank you, Casa Árabe, Fundación Alternativas, for the opportunity and the challenge to summarize and sort of wrap up this wonderful panel. It's really hard to summarize everything in just a few minutes, but I think we've had three presentations that very, very nicely speak to each other and in a way cover all the aspects, all the matter that makes international politics. So I really, the academic in me, I really appreciated seeing a dialogue between the different dimensions of international politics, the material / political economy factors that Cinzia and Fatiha have touched upon, as well as the ideational power struggle. This interplay can be seen in quite a few examples that have been given by the speakers. I also appreciated the effort to make connections between different levels of analysis. And here is where I think I can say a few words. We've had a couple of points from Fred, Cinzia, about the global dimension and the global power shifts that explain a lot of what's happening in the relations between the Maghreb and the Gulf, and the motivations because this panel was focusing on the motivations and the driving forces for Gulf intervention in the Maghreb. I guess we will have more of the Maghreb perspective in the second panel. So this global power shift is both ideational, has to do with this crisis of the liberal international order that everybody's speaking about right now, but it's also material, as Cinzia said, the rise of China and the growing size of trade between Europe and China has changed or revamped the importance of trade corridors and infrastructure corridors across the Mediterranean. And the other, or the link to this, is the issue of the decline of US hegemony, which is also both ideational and material. So this is the global background. Then another theme that ran through the three presentations concerns the competition, power competition between different Arab Gulf players in the Maghreb. This is something that, for instance, we could very clearly see in all of the examples that Cinzia mentioned about the ports, the digital infrastructure connections, and the energy connections in the eastern, central, and western corridors across the Maghreb. Another very clear example of this competition has to do with the link between domestic politics and regional politics in the Libyan conflict, and how we saw this first stage of Gulf intervention in the conflict, in the first stage of the conflict in Libya in 2011 with the first civil war. Then this turned into a more managed competition during the political transition stage, and ended up degenerating into full proxy war after 2014. Something really interesting about this is the role of individuals in channeling Gulf influence into Libyan politics. The role of individuals is something that Fatiha has also emphasized when she said that there's been a certain estrangement in the relations between Morocco and Saudi Arabia after the arrival to power of Mohammed bin Salman, due to his lesser familiarity with Morocco and with Moroccan networks. So this importance of individuals and individual networks is also something that all the speakers have referred to in one way or another. And I think I'm gonna stop here because I don't want to take more time, but I'm really looking forward to the next panel, because now we need to hear about the Maghrebi responses to all of these types of intervention and all of these power dynamics that are being played in their countries.
Thank you, Irene, for this executive summary, for also picking up all the threads between our three brilliant panelists. And many thanks to Fatiha Dazi-Héni, to Cinzia Bianco, to Frederic Wehrey, thank you for being able also to give us share some of your time, and to connect from Paris, Berlin, Washington, and the UK. We will now head to the second panel. The second panel will have a different lineup. And we'll have connections from Tunis and Doha and Madrid. Bear with us less than a couple of minutes. We'll just change the configuration of our screens for our next guests. And my colleague, Ichazo Dominguez de Olazábal, will be with you very short. So thank you again. And remember, we have more. Unfortunately, we couldn't go as in-depth as we wanted due to lack of time, but we'll be back very, very shortly with the second panel, Regions in Transformation, Adjusting to New Social, Economic, and Political Realities.